Hey, this is Zach Log the Great, and I am here with my friends Nate
Yep, that's me with the crying baby in the background.
and Chris.
Hello.
And tonight we are getting together to discuss C.S. Lewis's poem, Nearly They Stood, um, which I will throw in one thing starting off. Um, this actually was it was originally published as part of one of his books, The Pilgrim's Regress, which was an allegorical novel C.S. Lewis wrote, effectively describing his conversion to Christianity. Um, I have the book and I've read it, although it's been a while. So but it's an interesting book and I would recommend it. But it does take. It's not. I think C.S. Lewis later commented about it that he did not yet know how to write easy books, and so it does take some work. But
What is known as a
that
challenging read.
a little bit. Well, it's also weird because like the edition I have, it has little notes at the top of each page, kind of interpreting the allegory a little bit, and so like I don't remember if it was Lewis commenting on this or someone else, but I remember someone saying like they were frustrated because without the notes, it was almost impossible, and with those little notes, it was too easy. It was like too much handed to you. So it's like there needs to be a middle ground. Anyway, so I have to just well, yeah. Before I go, just purely emotional reaction, Chris. Like, what do you what's your general feeling going into and coming out of this one?
Uh, it feels very relatable. Sort of it just sort of gave me the impression that success and failure, like it's almost out of your control in a way, where the little things that might get you, you might not even notice. So in a way, it's kind of better to just stay even more vigilant. But I'm not sure. It I'm really not sure.
Okay, so Nate, just like I said, it just purely emotional impressions. How does it hit you in the feels? Because that's what matters.
Well, I mean, as the kids say, if we're talking about quote feels, I've always been sort of woke. Am I using that right? Anyway, I just kind of was like, yeah, this all makes sense. There's all these little bitty sort of things going on, and in the end, you never know where you're going to end up. This decision might save your life, it might kill you, or it might be essentially meaningless. You never know.
Yeah, I got to be honest. Like this one, okay. I mean, for one thing, knowing the author and also knowing the book this came from, I definitely read this as talking about like salvation, effectively, and like in that context, I got to be honest. This poem kind of terrifies me, um, because the idea, like you said, you know, those who make it, those who you know are found, you know, what is like the Bible says, what is it? You know, straight is the gate, and narrow the gate, and straight the road that lead to salvation, and not a lot make it. But the road that leads to hell, the gate's broad, and the road is easy to travel, and just thinking about it in those terms and thinking about it in that context, this poem scares the heck out of me because it's just you know what if I make that one decision or what if I've already made that one decision that turns me that badly, that hurts, that warps me that badly.
It's not one major decision. See, that's where I would disagree with that reading of the poem, is that it's not one major decision that suddenly you're the villain, that suddenly your will is now enslaved to the enemy. It's the big pile of little decisions and small compromises that sort of scratch up, and eventually, you're like, oh God, I've been taken so far afield, step by step.
Yeah,
Dalinar's question: what's the most important step? The next one.
Yeah, it's and that's true. That was
Spoiler alert.
How I was phrasing that. That was not probably not the best phrasing, but like, I mean, like you said, it's just this tiny little edge between complete failure and success and survival,
and not only that, but you don't know whenever you've crossed it. It's whenever you've looked back,
right,
where you realize
that is
how
true.
important it is.
And it's it actually, go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess what gets me is it's that notion of looking back, and seeing that when your will, quote, your will yet unenslaved, could have, you could have decided that, no, I'm not going to allow this little compromise that started me down the path, the little death of 1,000 cuts that I've undergone. But that idea of your will being now enslaved, where you're like almost beyond hope. That's the part. That's the part that terrifies me, is that really strikes me, is I would hate to be one of those people looking back and suddenly realizing that, oh my God, I'm not who I thought I was. Am I the bad guy?
Are we the baddies?
You got a little skull on your helmet.
Are we the baddies? Chris, you were gonna.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is from the perspective of somebody who's going to take the time and evaluate their actions. So this is somebody who is already worried about that misstep in the first place, but is afraid that they failed despite being conscious of this.
Yeah, and it's crud. I had something from what Nate said, but I lost it. But it's there's this actually reminds me of I've already C.S. Lewis, and I've already referenced the Bible once, so I'll throw in another one. Although I should know the reference. But it says work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
That's one of the epistles.
Sorry?
That's one of the epistles.
Yeah. No, I knew it was Paul, but more specific.
The really angry apostle.
But and it's you can't just sit back and say, well, I'm in, and just roll comfortably, because you don't, like, I mean, it's not from what he, it's also one of those ones where it almost contradicts itself or has paradox, because that same verse says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to accomplish it. Or I'm mixing up the last part, but like, do everything you can, do not rest on what you've already got, because God is doing it in you. And it's like, well, is it me? Is it God? Well,
you have to submit your will to him and do as he says. And if you follow God's guidance and the leadership of the Spirit, then yes, it will be worked out in you according to God's will. But if you decide to do your own thing, God's not going to just, meat puppet you and be like, all right, you're now just going to do what I want you to do without any input from your own will. It's a joint effort where your effort is submission and God's effort is, refining.
Yeah, I just remembered what it was I meant to say earlier, and it was from, you're talking about the will yet unenslaved, and to give kind of an extreme case, but it is what he's talking about here. Um, it's easy for someone to choose to, take their first hit of heroin or their second hit. And they can choose that or they can choose not to. And at that point, it's relatively easy. But at some point, actually having a choice in that becomes very, very difficult. And, and at some point, maybe not even possible. And, and that's an extreme example, but it's the same thing for, every sin in our lives. It's easy to choose not, the first time it's easy to choose not to lose your temper. But after you've lost your temper a few times, after you've, yelled or even, physically struck out, a few times, choosing not to, you've kind of laid in a rut, and choosing not to do that starts to take real effort. And it's,
that also works the other way, though. If you consistently choose to do things the correct way, then that becomes the habit. So whenever you do either the good or the bad without thought, just because that's what you do, that could be the difference between the ones who stood and the ones who fell.
Yeah. Although it does seem, but just by nature of, the world we live in, it's always, no matter how long you've been on the path to virtue, there's always an easy exit right in sight if you wanna take a turn off, and it doesn't seem.
Yeah, well, I mean that's kind of how Old Nick would plan it. He's gonna make it real easy to get back into vice. That big broad road.
So, have either of you read much else of C.S. Lewis's poetry, by the way?
No.
I haven't read any of his poetry. I've read Mere Christianity and I think The Four Loves, but I think that's about it by him.
Yeah, I read the Screwtape Letters and all of Narnia except for like the second or third book.
Okay, I was just curious. I've actually I've done a few of them. I've recorded a few of them, so I might if we keep doing this long enough, I might see if you want to circle back and talk about some of the ones I've done earlier.
To be honest with you, this whole thing has been interesting to me because really honestly, poetry. I was talking to somebody the other day, my wife, I think. I was talking that poetry hasn't really been a big sort of devotion in my life. There's a few poets I really enjoy, pretty much one. So I read their poems, but I don't really spend a lot of time going over poetry because,
Well, and see, I think part of that, and that's part of why I started recording these on my channel, is because I think the way that poetry is taught today is just in the way poetry is taught today in our school system is just a complete disaster, especially for men.
Absolutely.
The idea that poetry can be like about, can be manly, can be like forceful, can be about a fight to survive. It's just not out there. And also, and like it's even, and it seems like the way it's taught even in high school is that it's poetry because it's really hard to understand. And so like some of the first things I wrote, some of the first poems I wrote, basically I was making them as like obscure and self-referential as possible because I thought that's what it was supposed to be. And and so part of the reason I'm doing this is because I'm trying to find things that show no, poetry can be something very different from what you think it is from what you've seen, from what you've been taught and what you've seen.
Right.
And so,
It's important to realize that it's not like people don't appreciate the elements of poetry. Even people that don't particularly care for the genre, like hip hop, rap, a lot of stuff like that actually deals with some very poetic elements. It's just sort of the subject matter that doesn't quite mesh up. But I believe it's MC Lars, is it, that actually teaches young school children, like grade age school children, I believe, a little bit about poetry by having them adapt. What's his name? Like stuff like The Raven, and those.
he has one. He has one from Moby Dick, and I think there's a video of it where he basically has a bunch of like school kids, like elementary school kids, like participating in like making the video and dramatizing the story.
Well, and he had one where he actually had the kids themselves adapt Mask of the Red Death.
Jeez. Okay, that's it. Wait, that's
all right then.
Is that a poem or is that a short story? I thought that was a short story.
That's a short story.
I believe it's a short story, but come on, guys, help me. What's the name of the poet?
Poe, Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes,
Poe.
That should have been obvious. I was drawing a blank. But yes, I listened to a talk that he gave, and he was talking about how a lot of Poe's like meters and whatnot, the different elements he uses, actually meshes really well with modern hip hop. And a lot of the sort of like horror imagery is still relatively popular with young people. It's not like flowery and seemingly unapproachable. So he actually uses that as an avenue to connect those two seemingly different worlds, but they actually have a lot of basis. Just as humans, we like interesting wordplay and clever rhymes and whatnot. So it's just sort of the classical form of it that I feel like is sort of been pushed to the wayside.
Well, and like, the other thing, and, this is the earliest writing we have, is all in verse, is all with meter. And I don't think the Greeks used rhyme. I don't know where that entered in, but it's, definitely metrical and, uses other, poetic devices we would recognize. And that was just...
Well, that's a byproduct, of this sort of oral tradition. Because I mean, just sitting here trying to recite something somebody said is tough. But if you have sort of like a hook, a little mechanic you can use to break it up into easily digestible pieces, like the stanza, verse, that kind of thing, to give it a pattern, our brains latch onto it a lot faster, makes it a lot easier to memorize.
So to return to this particular poem, I'd forgotten about this. There was something I found interesting when I was working on this one. It's kind of, and this also returns to the idea of like, poetry can be something very different. It's C.S. Lewis, who, is, pretty well known for Christians, kind of for his analytical mind and for like rationally like pulling apart these ideas of theology and Christianity and explaining why they're not just something we can and should believe, but why they make sense. And it was kind of funny to me when I was working on this to realize that this poem, nearly they stood, it almost sounds like a syllogism, and in poetic form, which is just, meshing two things that are about as far apart as possible, you'd think. Because, there's this, and then there's this, therefore this. And it's, the people who didn't make it, the people who failed, the people who, were damned, some of them nearly made it. The people who did make it, many of them nearly didn't make it. Many of them came very close to failure. Therefore, I, live with this fear that at any moment I could make that kind of misstep. and it's I just like that element of it because it's like a like I said, almost major premise, minor premise, conclusion, and seeing that in poetic form is kind of fun.
Right, and success and failure seem so different, but he shows just how close they are. That is really neat. I hadn't noticed that.
Well, and the other thing is, it's and people talk about this in terms of like large scale things in science, and the weather, but like even in an individual's life, there's like the what they call the butterfly effect, that a tiny change, just 1 point, can have enormous consequences farther down the road, and it's. I think it's kind of impossible to keep this in mind all the time just because of the way life is. You have to go to work, you have to, pump gas, you have to buy groceries, you have to wash dishes. And I think it's kind of impossible to live with this in mind all the time just because of the way of that kind of thing. At the same time, it's living life in the light of eternity, realizing that every single thing you do now is something you're going to have to look back on and either regret or give thanks for forever. So well, was someone about to start?
You kind of laid a big one on us there.
Okay.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me think, it's like, how much of it is anything that is like just completely within your control? Is it more or less random?
I'm sorry. I'm laughing because I just started reading a book by Nicholas Taleb. And he wrote this isn't. I'm reading Skin in the Game, but he's also the one who wrote Fooled by Randomness, I think, and he refers back to his earlier books, and he says, basically the point of that book is not that everything is dumb luck, but there is a lot more of chance to life than we like to think. At the same time, though, there's if you're talking about moral choice and becoming who you ought to be, I don't think you can be judged on chance. I don't think we will be judged on what happened. I think we will be judged on our choices.
Right, but that depends on exactly what sort of success and what sort of failure he's talking about.
Yeah, and there's
layers to that, right?
Yeah.
It might be that, you could apply this to just sort of the, oh boy, I'm sure glad, for my general store, I decided to stock, more gingham aprons than pitchforks, because I might have lost that, I might have wasted that money and not been in a position to, deal with the big laundry disaster of 48, and then I wouldn't have been able to, buy the extra pistol rounds for my hardware counter and, on until, so who knows, maybe if I had decided to buy more pitchforks instead, I wouldn't have made that money. My business would have folded. Or it could be, it could be a matter of physical life and death. Like, if I hadn't decided to, stop and tie my shoes, I might have, been stepping out into the crosswalk when this out of control car swerved through and would have turned me to cheese. Or it could be, eternal consequences like Sean's talking about. It's kind of an interesting poem because it can apply on a lot of different levels.
Well, and the other thing, which is also good to keep in mind, is
Ecclesiastes.
well, yeah, that too. No, I don't want to go shoot myself after we're done here, so I'm not talking about Ecclesiastes.
Hey, Ecclesiastes is awesome. I find it a very affirming book. Okay, you got to understand. All right, Ecclesiastes, right? Living with this idea of eternity in the back of your mind. Okay, is that what you have to understand is that yes, our lives are temporal. They're short, fleeting things, right? Everything is vanity, or as the Hebrew word was hevel, which is smoke. You know, it's there for a moment. It looks more solid than it is. It can obscure your vision of the distance, but also at the same time, it can be beautiful and kind of nice. And so, you know, we have to understand that yes, everything will come to an end. Everything is a vapor, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't enjoy it. Because I mean, that's kind of the conclusion the writer of Ecclesiastes draws is that yes, this is all temporary, and in the end, all the work we do will not endure after us. So what should we do? Well, we should enjoy our work under the sun, you know, love the wife of our youth, eat, drink, and be merry, you know, and then in the back of our mind, the Lord has placed this idea of eternity to sort of keep us honest, that, you know, to remind us that, yes, there is something after this. You know, He put eternity in our hearts, but then He didn't allow our minds to conceive of the fullness of what He has done from beginning to end, so that we have to seek Him and rely on Him to navigate all this randomness that happens. You know, the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. Time and chance happen to all. But, you know, you don't see the righteous forsaken. So you know, Ecclesiastes has a very realistic tone to it, but it also has a note of hope that I think applies to this situation. You know, and sort of this idea that we're talking about from Lewis, which is that yes, all these little bitty things and all these, you know, tiny changes of direction can lead you astray if you let it. But if you know, keep hold of that little string of eternity God put in your heart, then, you know, He'll make everything beautiful in its time. And you don't have to worry so much about, oh my gosh, am I going off the rails here? Because God can keep you straight.
Yeah. And one other thing, which you know, this is a personal and rather immediate example. I'm currently suffering from self-inflicted insomnia. That is, you know, one or two nights I stayed up later than I should, and then the next night it's harder to get to sleep when I should. And it's also kind of frustrating to, you know, when you've seen yourself doing these kind of things, to realize just how much a small decision like that can affect, you know, how you treat other people, can affect, you know, how well you control your temper, and, you know, how good you are resisting this or that other temptation. And so, you know, even something as simply as apparently insignificant as your bedtime, you know, can have you know, moral implications.
That's true. I will have to dip out for just a moment, but I will return. Sounds like one of the boys is crying.
Okay. So, honestly, I think I've gotten out most of the big thoughts I had about this. Chris, was there anything else you wanted to, any other big topics?
Well, I did want to say, like, at first, I definitely saw how you could take it as sort of the moral level. But while y'all were discussing it, I noticed where he does, in the second part, look back and note how near they grazed that siren's land. And that definitely does indicate a sort of temptation.
Yeah.
So it was more once y'all started talking about it where I realized, like, how much that was in here.
Well, and you know, I'm actually glad you were reading it that other way, because I think that makes sense as well. And it wasn't something it wasn't something I'd considered. So, you know, that's the fun of having these talks, that, you know, you get to have, you know, new perspectives on things you thought you understood and thought you had given serious consideration to. So,
Right, because I had taken it more as sort of like somebody who had like run a race or that sort of thing, like the one spot where they just had to swerve and couldn't do it. Where if they were just a little bit better, they had just been paying a little bit more attention, they could have succeeded.
Okay, well, I kind of hate to do this to Nate, but we can talk more off of the broadcast when he comes back. But I think I'm gonna wrap this up wrap this up for tonight. So,
Well,
go.
couldn't you always just edit this part out and just jump back to when he gets back?
I could, but I'm lazy. I honestly I'm not terribly good with video editing software just yet. I've had a friend help me out with that on some of my videos that required that kind of thing. So and I do kind of think we were running down on the poem anyway. So yeah, I'm gonna close out the recorded discussion, and we can keep talking a little bit, including when he gets back. So, thanks for joining me tonight, Chris, and God be with you.
Have a good one.